Good morning and welcome to the 26th meeting of 2024 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have apologies from Evelyn Tweed this morning. Our first agenda item is to agree to take item 3, which is consideration of today's evidence on the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Our second agenda item is to take evidence on the pause to introduce the introduction of the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill. This morning, we will hear from a panel of witnesses made up of member representatives and others representing people with learning disabilities, neurodivergent people and autistic people. And I welcome to the meeting Gregor Hardy, member representative, and Susan Burt, member representative from People First Scotland. Jamie Cook, Head of Policy Enable, Susie Martin, External Affairs Manager, National Autistic Society Scotland, Jenny Miller, Chief Executive PAMIS, Promoting a More Inclusive Society, who is joining us remotely, Joe Long, Director of Practice and Innovation, Scottish Autism, and Dr Simon Webster, Chief Executive, Scottish Commission for People with Learning Disabilities. You're all very welcome and thank you for attending this morning. We do have a larger panel than usual today, but we do have plenty of time, so I am going to take things steadily. And if I refer members to papers 1 and 2, and I will begin by asking our witnesses for a brief opening statement. I will begin with Gregor and then Susan, please.
So good morning. I represent the powerful voice of citizens with a learning disability in Scotland. I have the privilege of doing that because I'm a director, a member of People First Scotland, the disabled people's user-led organisation for learning disability. This committee has invited us to bring expertise and evidence a few times over recent years. We welcome the opportunity as a rare example of meaningful citizenship which recognises us as humans and experts in our lives. When we brought evidence previously, that happened through our partnership with Fraser of Allender Institute. It followed research by them that focused on the life experience of citizens with a learning disability that described Scotland's failure to realise our human rights. That institute's latest research states that while employers have a desire to recruit people with learning disabilities, they are lacking an understanding of how to do so. They reveal 5 key themes holding employers back. They are 1. Lack of knowledge leading to prejudice. 2. Lack of prioritisation. 3. Lack of intention and knowledge about how to recruit. 4. Not knowing where to start. And 5. A perceived cost barrier. Those things, in fact, apply to every aspect of our lives. Their impact reinforces the low expectations Scotland has for us. Susan and I will offer a number of examples in our evidence today. The proposed LDAM bill had ideas within it that had potential for change. We were hopeful that some of the changes that People First Scotland has campaigned for over our 35 years might finally move ahead, but we remain unheard. Action, not words, is required. Without legislation that is specific to us, Scotland will continue to fail us as humans with rights. People look at our website and take time to watch the film that tells you why legislation that is not specific to us in Scotland will continue to fail us. So I'm now going to hand over to Susan.
Thank you, Gregor. I also represent the powerful voice of citizens with a learning disability in Scotland. Like Greg, I have the privilege of doing this because I'm a director and a member of People First Scotland. My network with partners organisations include Equally Safe Project, development and wide range of women's health, women's rights and gender-based violence. I represent People First on the Adult Support and Protection Committee within Fife. I bring our collective learning disability life experience to the areas of policy development, government and decision makers. Some of the examples of life which illustrates that. The 5 themes holding back Scotland from employing us that Greg mentioned were from resources about employment. We agree employment is one part of life where we are failed, but the failure touches every part of our life. Overall, the lack of knowledge of our lives that lead to prejudice is made worse when we are not seen. Some of us are still locked away in hospitals. The policy says that should not happen, but it still does. Many of us that do live in streets have tendencies and that might be part of the local life, but we still experience incidents of hate daily that do result in us being invisible. Members say that verbal abuse is a daily misery being called things like Mongo and Down syndrome while we're travelling or when we're shopping. One woman spoke about not opening the curtains or going near the windows because if she was seen by the local youth gathering opposite, they would start shouting and making offensive gestures. Lack of knowledge can also impact our lives even before we or our children are born. Parents who have a learning disability are not supported in private or family life. Society does not see us as sexually beings or human that are entitled to live lives like others, whether with partners or alone. Social workers act to remove our children rather than supporting us in our journey. As parents, many members still find that they are given no option other than to live with others. That happens for young people as well as those who are older. We keep hearing that support for choice and independent living costs too much unless we are grouped together. Regulations use words like dignity, but where is that for us? After all, other society chooses who they live with and where. We are not a priority for Scotland. We will say more about that in our answers to each of the committee's questions. There are 2 people we employ here as support while we give this evidence today. Frank David, a National Development Worker, and Rona Neal, the Service Manager. Greg and I may speak to them or ask them to remind us which of the notes we have prepared for our answers. Thank you for giving us a little time to do that if we choose to do it during the session here today.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to Jamie, please.
Thank you, Convener. So my name is Jamie Cook. I'm Head of Policy at Enable, which is one of Scotland's largest social care charities. And we were set up 70 years ago by a group of parents looking to create better opportunities for their children with learning disabilities that weren't offered to them in society at the time. And we've been working ever since to try and help bring those to reality. So for us, working with our members and supporters across Scotland, we were very encouraged to see the bill being brought forward as a real commitment to too often, as we heard very powerfully from our colleagues here, the rights that the people we work for are not seeing delivered on a day-to-day basis, that we know exist and that they have the right to, but actually all too often there's no accountability, there's no follow-up and no opportunity to take those forward. So whilst we welcome that, we therefore are also disappointed to see the lack of progress with the bill, as we'll explore in more detail today. I think this is a real chance for Scotland to be a world leader, but I suppose our challenge is whether it's a world leader in rhetoric or whether it's a world leader in reality, and I hope we can explore that in a bit more detail today. And I think really see how this has been an effort across sector, across organisations to really try and drive progress in a very collaborative way, and hopefully still a chance for us to do that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And then move on to Susie, please.
Hi there, I'll keep this brief so we can get on to questions. My name is Susie Martin, I'm the External Affairs Manager for the National Autistic Society Scotland. We're part of the UK-wide National Autistic Society, which is a charity seeking to create a society that works for autistic people. We provide support to autistic people and their families, and we also seek to improve outcomes for autistic people and address the systemic injustices that they face by influencing policy and legislation and campaigning for change. We were deeply disappointed by the delay to the bill, and we believe that it has the potential to be transformative for autistic people and their families. It was also an opportunity for Scotland to lead the way, and I would say now that Scotland risks falling behind. It is already falling behind England in particular, where there's already been an Autism Act for a number of years. There's already mandatory training for health and social care professionals, where data on waiting times is collected, disaggregated and published. So looking forward to exploring this more with the committee and why autistic people and their families do feel let down at best and at worst abandoned at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to Jenny, please.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you, Jenny.
Thank you very much. So PAMIS is a charity promoting a more inclusive society who works with children, young people and adults who have a profound learning and multiple disabilities and their families, supporting them to lead healthy, valued and inclusive lives. This group of people and their families continue to be some of the most marginalised and isolated within their communities and suffer huge inequalities in both health and social care. Pre-COVID, their circumstances were difficult, but since the pandemic, this has been exacerbated. And unlike the rest of society, this group have remained in crisis. The community are at the back of the queue, continue to be forgotten, undervalued, let down, and the promises made throughout the pandemic have been broken. The return of services, respite, health interventions and a relief to the 24/7 caring role have not been realised, and instead families are left to battle. The Eldan Bill, the Equalities and Human Rights legislation and the National Care Service were rays of hope, and this community embraced ideas, innovations and solutions. The halt on these greatly impact on this community, as the current situation that they find themselves in is not sustainable and needs urgent action. This community, though, never ceased to amaze and inspire, and although I paint this dark picture that we're currently in, there are real solutions and suggestions. We highlight profound to mean deep, wise and expert, and as ever this group teaches to work collaboratively and utilise our collective wisdom to develop different approaches to solve the current problems we're encountering. We welcome being a part of this discussion today and ongoing, and being part of the solution, but we want to highlight that this will require different ways of working and of us listening with all our senses to the various groups of people that the Eldan Bill sought to support. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Joe, please.
Hi, I'm Joe Long. I'm Director of Practice and Innovation at Scottish Autism. Scottish Autism is a charity and Scotland's largest provider of autism-specific services, and we're also advocates for change and good practice everywhere. We hear every day in our advice line, in our family support services, our social care and education services, from autistic people and from families who have to fight for the support that they deserve. They don't receive the understanding and accommodations to which they're entitled, and we know that autistic people are really disproportionately excluded from education, formally and informally, have difficulty accessing health services and public services of different kinds, and continue to have this fight on their hands. Now, after a lot of well-meaning legislation, after multiple reviews, after a 10-year strategy, I think there's been a lot of hope invested in this bill to provide the mechanisms that will finally deliver on people's rights, the mechanisms for change that need to happen, for those rights to be delivered upon, for those services to be received. But people haven't just invested hope, they've invested a lot of time. They've given of themselves, they have told their stories, often quite traumatic stories, in the hope that this time we might see real change. This bill, if it is affected and has the right provisions, can make that real change for people's lives. We must not miss this opportunity, and that's what our community are telling us loudly and clearly every day.
Thank you. And I'll hear from Simon, please.
Good morning. Simon Webster, Chief Executive of SLD for roughly 4 weeks so far, but well briefed and from a relevant background. The Commission hopes that this bill will be the framework which ensures that people with learning disabilities have access to well-resourced support from all professionals in whatever areas of life this may be required, and have equal access to all areas of Scottish society. More fundamentally, this bill needs to redefine people with learning disabilities as equal citizens who, without exception, are equally valuable members of our society. Scotland's understanding of people with learning disabilities is shaped by a history which includes segregation, institutionalisation and dehumanisation. In 2024, the legacy of the institutions continues to provide context for this work, and our law has been shaped by that legacy. In practice, the shift away from long-term detention of people with learning disabilities is not complete. Our understanding is still shaped by a view that learning disability is primarily a health concern. From that perspective, social and economic problems for this community were seen as the inevitable consequence of a condition. But those problems are not inevitable consequences. Social and economic problems are barriers which disable this community. Our society's understanding of learning disability has shifted, but these barriers continue to exist, at least in part, because Scotland's perspective on this community does not fully recognise people with learning disabilities as equals in all areas of life. So, the bill process is our main opportunity to accept how people with learning disabilities see themselves, to reflect that to our society, and to define people with learning disabilities primarily as people, as equal citizens, not as patients first. The Scottish Commission for People with Learning Disabilities looks forward to the transformational change which this bill can help to bring about.
Thank you. Thank you all for your contributions so far. We will now move on to questions from members, and I will begin by asking, what has been your involvement with the development of the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill? And I will come to Gregor first, please. Okay, we have Susan.
For months, our groups and members looked at different parts of the consultation. We sometimes had to choose different experts from our groups and memberships to look at different parts. That was because there were so many questions. We are still speaking about all those things through, because we always do. Even though the consultation has come to an end, we talk about our lives and the future and the lack of change all the time. We continue to fight until we are heard. The Latin Bill and what was proposed after the consultation period was never enough.
The whole idea of the Eldan Bill was not a fit for People First Scotland. Although we work in positive and respectful partnership and always have done, we have said all along that a law that is not only about learning disability is what Scotland needs. That would be meaningful for us. It could offer us dignity as humans with rights. The proposed Eldan Bill had ideas within it that members of People First thought had potential. but People First Scotland has for 35 years described clearly and as experts the changes required. And at the top of the list is for us to be recognised as human rights holders with experience that is unique. We ask for legislation that sees us that way and does not group us with others. Although there is a plan to go ahead with actions on Eldan, we still hope that the expert message we bring will be respected, heard and acted on. Actions, not words. Please look at our website and take time to watch the film that tells you why legislation that is not specific to us in Scotland will continue to fail us.
Okay, thank you. Can I come to Jamie now, please?
Thank you. So first and foremost, our engagement has come through working with our members and people we represent to work with them to see what it is that they need and what they're looking for, which is very much about accountability for the rights that do exist for them, but which far too often, and as colleagues have covered already, are denied them on a regular basis. From that, we've worked very closely with other organisations, particularly with Scottish Autism and National Autistic Society, around campaigning around the bill itself and how it could take shape, and also engaging with activity across Scotland with our members. So we've run a large number of events in different parts of the country to ensure that as many voices within our community could be heard as possible, as well as finally being part of the stakeholder group that was brought together to work through the process of the bill. So throughout this, being driven by our members and their needs, but also seeing how collaboratively we can have a greater impact on this rather than simply driving it as a single organisation.
Thank you. Susie, please.
Hi, yeah. So to understand our involvement in the development of the bill, we actually have to go back to 2011 and the publication of the Autism Strategy for Scotland. That was a 10-year strategy which came to an end in 2021. And the independent evaluation of that strategy found that it had failed to create the systemic change that was needed and the sustained change that was needed to improve outcomes and address the systemic injustices that autistic people face. And a review of the cross-party group on autism found the same thing, and in fact found that at the end of the strategy, 72% of people still did not have enough support to meet their needs, and 78% felt that support was still too difficult to access in their local area. And that led us to acknowledge that there was what we termed an accountability gap, sometimes called an implementation gap. So a gap between the support that people should receive, that's outlined in policy and strategies, and sometimes that they are entitled to in law, and what they actually receive in reality. And we worked with Scottish Autism and Enable to then campaign for a commissioner for autistic people and people with learning disabilities as a means to address that accountability gap. That was called the Our Voice, Our Rights campaign in the run-up to the 2021 Holyrood election. We were delighted that a commitment to legislate was made in several party manifestos, and that the commitment was also published in the programme for government in 2021 by the Scottish Government, both to legislate and to establish a commissioner. And that triggered a process which you're all very, very familiar with. We were involved in the scoping exercise. We helped to facilitate engagement with autistic people through that exercise. We were a member of the stakeholder panel along with other organisations here today and worked collaboratively with them throughout the process. And there were two other panels, and I just want to quickly say that we think that the Lived Experience Advisory Panel that the Scottish Government established was an excellent panel and did great work in advising the Scottish Government and really drove the delivery of the proposals and the publication of the public consultation on the bill. So we've been involved from the outset along with colleagues on this panel, and we hope to continue to work with the Scottish Government and colleagues.
Thank you. Jenny, please.
Like Susie says, we've been involved with colleagues and we're part of the stakeholder group. And as an organisation, we ensured that we sought the views of our community that we support. But what we also recognise that a lot of things that were being talked about and asked about had been on the cards with our community for the last 32 years. And so we spent quite a bit of time going back over what families have been asking for and what people with a profound learning and multiple disability were requiring. And then we cross-checked that with the community to check that what we were saying within the consultation was what was still current. I mean, very sadly, it is 32 years of sort of limited progress, which is why this bill is so important. So our community being creative and innovative and solution focused, trying to think about ideas to support more inclusive and equitable world, and where we're all valued. But yes, it's been quite an overwhelming process, I think. But I think a process that was seeking to be as inclusive as possible, and we were very grateful for the support, being a small organisation, from the organisations that you're meeting with today. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, please.
Thanks very much. Both Susie and Jenny have given a sort of picture of the long-term sort of forces that led to our involvement. We campaigned ahead of the 2021 election with a particular focus on accountability. We felt that there'd been a lot of legislation, good legislation frameworks in place, but we really need to see some mechanism for accountability. So that was a big focus of our campaign. It's also worth adding into the picture that we had the Rome Review of Autism and Learning Disability and the Mental Health Act reported in early 2021, which also made recommendation for a commissioner for autistic people and people with learning disabilities. And we welcomed that report in particular, and that gave us a bit of an impetus to campaign around accountability and a potential commissioner role. We were also part of the stakeholder panel that the Scottish Government team convened around the development of this bill. Thirdly, also just want to sort of emphasise, which others have alluded to, organisations like ours did an awful lot of work to engage people in the consultation that went into this bill. Autistic people who might have diverse communication styles, who might have additional learning disabilities, may have found it difficult to respond directly to the public consultation. And I think both the consultation report and indeed the presses of it that were provided in the briefing for today show the number of responses, but it's worth saying that some of those single responses represent organisations which engaged tens, hundreds of people who may have found it difficult to engage themselves. So organisations like us did a lot of legwork, really, in engaging people, in taking that message forward from the Scottish Government that people wanted to hear their stories, hear their experiences. And so that was another big factor in our involvement in the development of this bill.
Thank you. Simon, please.
So the Eldan Bill consultation was the main focus for the Commission's work this year. And following on from what others have said, it has been a huge undertaking. It resulted in some amazing contributions from people with learning disabilities and the wider community. But we found that there just wasn't anything like the time that was needed for people with learning disabilities to be fully engaged across all areas of the consultation. The Commission also made contributions to the accessibility of the process for people with learning disabilities across Scotland, for example, by creating animations on how laws are made, how to respond to a consultation, through accessible briefings, through supporting wider engagement with around 180 people and presenting in consultation to around 250, by supporting 4 of our own programmes and networks to respond, and through a response of our own running to around 80 pages.
Thank you all. What difference would the bill make to people with learning disabilities and neurodivergent people in Scotland? And I'll come to Gregor and Susan first, please.
As we have said in the answer to question 1, changes from a bill that is not focused on and about the life of citizens with a learning disability only will be too weak. The inclusion of other groups always leaves us last, also at the bottom of the list.
We have been at the bottom of Scotland's list forever. We are invisible in society and community. Some of us remain hidden and locked up in hospital. Promises, for example, the coming home work deadline are broken. The Scottish Government promised to significantly reduce long hospital stays and out-of-area residential placements for people with learning disabilities or complex needs by March 2024. We set a countdown clock running on our website that was said, when that was said. The deadline has been and gone without the commitment being met. You can see the image here on the cards being handed out to you. We are disappointed by the lack of progress, and we call on national and local governments to act now. The clock hit zero in March. Change has not taken place for many people at all. The change will only be good enough when no one has hospital as their home. People First founding members said that at our founding conference in 1989. We continue to say it. Although we welcomed some ideas in the Eldon Bill proposals, it is simply not enough.
Jamie, please.
Thank you. So our drive at Enable is to ensure that everyone has the chance to live full and active lives in the communities of their choice. And for us, the Eldon Bill is the chance to give the rights that already exist a legislative footing for that accountability gap that Susie touched on. So it would make a massive difference to the people we work for in giving them both that recognition of the challenges and the exclusions that they currently face, but also giving those mechanisms that were touched on earlier to actually drive where they aren't being met, to ensure that authorities and others are held accountable where they fall short, and also to ensure that we can help support sharing of best practice and approaches in different places. I think that's essential for us to give that sense of progress. It's been touched on by several colleagues today about how long this has been. This is not a new process. This needs this sense of change and of real embedding in a way that can't just be overturned too quickly. Excuse me. I think there's real positives around how the legislation is being approached through a human rights focus by giving that sense of inclusion. The LEAP was mentioned as a fantastic example of actually bringing people with experience to the forefront of designing policy. This is fantastic to see, but if it doesn't go anywhere, that can have those negative implications in terms of the next steps. And also, as touched on earlier and others have said, this is a world-leading opportunity. We find that there's huge interest in what's happening here in Scotland from colleagues across Europe and beyond. We hosted earlier this year Europe in Action, for the first time in Scotland, a large international gathering of 450 practitioners and self-advocates from across Europe who were looking to Scotland to learn from our journey of deinstitutionalisation, but to see how we were trying to bring human rights embedded practice and law into reality. So I think there's also this fantastic chance where the people we work for are seeing a way that their experience has an opportunity to shape changes across the world. The legislation would give a chance for that to be embedded. Of course, if it's not taken forward, it also gives that chance of undermining that quite significantly.
Thank you. Susie, please.
Thank you. Yeah, the bill absolutely has the potential to be transformative, as I've said, for autistic people and their families. And I can't emphasise this enough. There is an urgent need to legislate, and that is evident in the outcomes that autistic people face. Autistic children and young people, along with others with additional support for learning needs, are 5 times more likely to be excluded from education than their peers. That does not include informal and internal exclusions, of which there is an epidemic in this country. Only 29% of autistic people are thought to be in employment in the UK. It is thought that that could be even lower in Scotland. Autistic people face much poorer health than non-autistic people, especially poor mental health, and are likely to die younger than neurotypical people. And as has already been mentioned, there are still hundreds of people with learning disabilities, many of whom are also autistic, who are living in hospitals and other institutional settings. So the outcomes speak for themselves and speak to the urgent need to legislate, and the bill definitely had the potential to be transformative in nature. In our view, there were 3 particular proposed provisions within the bill, that would have had a significant impact, and they were statutory strategies, mandatory training in the public sector, and, as Jamie has alluded to, an accountability mechanism to ensure that local government, service providers and national government are delivering for autistic people and people with learning disabilities. So, in our view, this bill is crucial in improving outcomes and addressing the systemic injustices that autistic people face today in Scotland.
Thank you. Jenny, please.
Really echoing many of Susie's really well articulated responses, but I guess our hope was that it would raise the profile and rights of people with a learning disability and though neurodivergent people in line with other groups within our society. And while hope had been that it would enable them to live healthy, valued and inclusive lives and combat many of the issues that Susie has just highlighted that have been ongoing for the last decades. Currently, all of these groups experience discriminatory practice and a lack of understanding of the value that they can offer our country. Their and our voices are not visible enough in decisions that are made. And if we reflect even on the evidence being gathered currently within the COVID inquiry, we can see what happens when a group or groups of people are not considered individually. There appears, as Susie and Jamie highlighted, to be no repercussions for policies and guidance not being taken forward. And I guess it was hoped that this bill would absolutely change this, that it would put people with a learning disability and neurodivergent people centre stage instead of being sidelined. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, please.
Thanks very much. Well, the difference the bill would make will depend, of course, on the content of the bill, and we've yet to see draft provisions. If we get it right, if the Scottish Government get it right, people would get the support they need when they need it. They would be included and feel included, whether that's in education, work or leisure activities, and we'd be in a world where people aren't just not in crisis but flourish and contribute to the best of their potential. But we need a clear picture of how that happens. We need to see accountability mechanisms for delivery. We need to see join up between different service areas. We need to see an end to crisis-led commissioning of services so people get timely support and don't have to fight for it. We need greater professional skills and understanding so that there's greater access and accommodation within healthcare, school, community services and so on. We want people to feel a better sense of well-being and a greater chance at finding a meaningful vocation, whether that's in employment or other means of occupation and vocation. And I think it's worth taking a moment to think about how this bill would intersect with other bits of policy work that are going on at the moment. It's worth saying that at the moment, autistic people and people with learning disabilities can be detained under the Mental Health Act. And not on account of mental illness, but on account of their neurodevelopmental profile. Organisations like ours want to see an end to that kind of discrimination in the system. The argument that's often made against it is that often if someone's in crisis or they need support urgently, the only lever that people have is health, hospitalisation, in some cases detention. If this bill gets it right and provides the right mechanisms to support people, to uphold the rights of autistic people and people with learning disabilities, that argument should go away. We should see the means by which the mechanisms are there to support people in their communities at the right time, and we'll see an end to detention under the Mental Health Act as a lever by which people get support and are made safe. So, I just wanted to give a nod to those other pieces of legislation processes that we want to see this bill aid. So, thanks very much.
Thank you. Simon.
Thank you. So, first, this bill can redefine people with learning disabilities as people first, as equal citizens. For people with learning disabilities who the Commission worked with in this consultation, the bill is massively significant. Its symbolism is huge. Those individuals felt that they were being seen as a priority. Second, in practical terms, the bill is our opportunity to collectively work out how we will complete and fully implement the cultural change which began with deinstitutionalisation. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities states that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. We understand that it can be technically complex and politically difficult to shift society towards this understanding of disability, but that's what Scotland has begun to do. We have begun to remove barriers which disable people. So we could say that the bill is Scotland's main vehicle for removing barriers from society which disable people with learning disabilities. For example, barriers to employment, barriers to autonomous decision-making, and barriers to physical health. Third, this bill is also perhaps the main vehicle for ensuring that there is, as others have said, specific and effective accountability for the removal of systemic barriers. The clear priority which we are hearing from people with learning disabilities and from carers for this bill is about strengthening accountability when publicly funded services are not provided or do not meet requirements. And, of course, people with learning disabilities continue to have poorer outcomes than other marginalised communities across a range of domains. So, in our view, this bill does need to provide for strategic planning with effective accountability. And fourth, in the process around developing this bill, we do need to determine how law reform will ensure the ending of inappropriate restraint, seclusion and related practices against people with learning disabilities of all ages. We need to determine what law reform will actually end the institutionalisation of people with learning disabilities in Scotland by ensuring that support needs are met in the community and by ending long-term detention on health grounds.
Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I really appreciate your time this morning. The consultation had 61 questions and there were a range of proposals and various options. What are your views on how the consultation was designed and undertaken? And I'll start with Susan.
People First absolutely welcomes the change over recent years that Scottish Government and other bodies have put in place to make accessible summary documents of consultation. That never used to happen. We have had to fight for this, and when it's done well, it feels meaningful and respectful. Still at this time, there is information missing or things are lost in translation. We still promote the idea that if you start with clear, easy-read instructions or information, then things are understandable. Producing something else with further technology or complicated information for those that want it can also be of use, but please start with the one that works best for everyone.
One of the things that made this consultation so complex was the point that we refer to in all of our answers. Grouping citizens with a learning disability with others is not what is required. Even when people who have lived experience that includes barriers that we face to life experience is different. Learning disability is unique. A law that supports our lives as humans is needed.
Marie, would you like to ask?
Jamie?
Yes, I think it was certainly a huge and complex consultation. It's a lot of questions and a lot of information to explore. And that certainly for us meant having to break that down into numerous smaller pieces to work with our members in a number of different settings. So that was very time intensive, making sure that we tried to engage as many different people as possible in as many different parts of the country. Really meant that we had to put quite a lot of effort into ensuring that we gave those different spaces and the different materials, as was touched on, to ensure that people had that chance. I think, going back to Joe's point earlier, that makes a very strong reflection, and we'll hear that from everybody, I think, on the panel today, about how committed and invested not only we as organisations, but those we represent really were in this piece of legislation. People gave up their time, their energy, their ideas and their efforts to really feed into this process to ensure that what was fed back on their behalf through Enable and through others really started to capture the importance of this for them. them. And I think that's something that's really important not to lose in this. There was a huge amount of effort put into this process because we believe it is so important for the people that we're working for and with. And I think making sure that that then is continued as we move forward, how we harness that without it being burnt out, I think is going to be one of our big challenges, but does show that that undercurrent of support was very much in place across the country and across the people certainly that we were working with.
Thank you. Susie, do you want to share your views?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, as I've already said, I think it's important to acknowledge that the Scottish Government did work very hard to put lived experience at the centre of the pre-legislative process and the development of proposed provisions and the public consultation. And we feel like the Lived Experience Advisory Panel was very effective. With regards to the public consultation itself, our understanding was that the Scottish Government wanted to put as much as it could on the table for people to have their views on, and that speaks to the fact that the challenges that autistic people face, the systemic injustices that they face, they experience throughout their whole life, and they cross many areas of government policy. And it was important to put as much of that on the table as possible to for people to be able to express their views and opinions on. That inevitably meant it was extensive and it was complex. I will leave it to other colleagues to comment on the easy read versions of the consultation. But because of that complexity and the extensive nature of the consultation, we would always go out and seek autistic people's views before responding to a consultation, but I guess it was more incumbent on us to do that this time because of how extensive the public consultation was and its complexity. We did encourage people to submit individual responses in addition to telling us their views, but we knew that many of the autistic people that we support and their families would not be able to engage with the public consultation as individuals. So it was very important for us to ensure that we were getting their views and representing their views in our public consultation. And as Jamie's alluded to, we were very committed to that process and very committed to ensuring that as many people as possible responded to the public consultation. So yes, it was extensive, yes, it was complex, but it was important that the public consultation did put as much as possible on the table for people to have their views on.
Do you want to share any views? Oh, you seem to unmute.
Am I unmuted? Sorry. It was extensive. It was enormous. At times it was overwhelming and it took up a huge amount of time. But I think as Susie was saying, it was that size because it needed to be, because there are so many areas that require to be addressed. But at times it became overwhelming, and for families that are very much engaged in a very intensive caring role, it was difficult for them probably to individually go back. But I think, as Jamie alluded, what we attempted to do, as with all the organisation, was to gather thoughts from across our communities. And what we looked at was we looked back over the last 32 years, and it provided us with an opportunity to gather a whole host of past and current information and an opportunity to engage with our community and to hear their views and to think about what the current issues were. And that piece of work has been able to be used in other areas as well. But I think the size of it probably did put off many people from completing individually. And that's why I think the role of organisations like ours and the ones gathered here today were just so important to enable and ensure that everybody's voices were heard. Like Susie, I want to really applaud the government for the fact that there was so much thought put into how this engagement took place. And I think, as a group of organisations, we all really tried to work together to make sure that there was a strong enough response to all of the proposals. It was difficult for us not to comment on them all, but yeah, I think I'll shut up there.
Thank you, Jenny. Joe, do you have any comments?
Certainly. Like colleagues here, we would commend, the team at the Scottish Government for the inclusive way they went around the pre-consultation work, the Lived Experience Advisory Panel, the stakeholder panels. Were all, great to be involved in and very productive. We did end up with a very long and complicated document, as colleagues have alluded to. I suppose to speak to that, what I would say is the fact that it had so many subsections, transport, social care, education and so on, probably speaks to the number of fronts on which autistic people, people with learning disabilities have to fight every day. That fragmented landscape, that often siloed policy landscape just shows actually how many fronts people have to fight on. And I think, in a way, the consultation reflected that. What we were kind of interested in seeing was those cross-cutting themes, those overarching themes of accountability, of knowledge and understanding, of access. I think that's where we have some hope for legislation. Is not that we reproduce many policy silos, but that we have legislation or a body or a system of accountability that looks across all of these different areas and identifies these themes and works to join up people's experience so they don't have to keep recounting their trauma to numerous different professionals in numerous different contexts. So I'd say, in a way, the complexity of it is quite telling about the experiences that people have of the system that they have to navigate. The other point to make is, I think we had some questions and we were a bit disappointed that autistic people in specifically were not mentioned more in the consultation. I think at Scottish Autism, we absolutely subscribe to the vision of a neuro-affirmative and inclusive society. People of every neurotype and profile are supported and accommodated, but we recognise there are specific forms of exclusion that autistic people face. And our feeling is that to have a neuro-inclusive society, a neurodiversity affirmative society, we need to meet the specific groups, specific needs of particular groups. And I don't know if that has come through in the form that the consultation took, or indeed the report that's come through from it. So there's a sort of note of caution there that we felt when we read the consultation and read the responses to it too. So I'll just add that in too.
Thank you, Joe. Finally, Simon.
Thank you. To agree with colleagues, we felt that the Scottish Government had carefully considered accessibility for the consultation, and that it was particularly complex, perhaps of necessity. There were 12 weeks, I understand, for the consultation from the end of 2023, and there was a large amount of evidence within the consultation document, as others have said, which did make it a difficult process. And we did find that some people with learning disabilities, all were very enthusiastic and very engaged in the work, but were often exhausted by the consultation. It took several months of intensive group work and individual work through the Commission to respond to just a few of the 22 areas that were out for consultation, so that the scale of what's required for accessibility in a consultation of this nature is really quite considerable. But again, to come back to the main point, accessibility was considered, the efforts were made, and I'm sure that further developments can be made.
Thank you. Thanks for your responses. Convener.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move into questions from Pam, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. What are your views on the Scottish Government's reasons for not introducing the bill during this parliamentary year? And do you think other pressures may have also played a role? Could I start off with Gregor, please? Was it Susan? Right, sorry.
Yes, people first mentioned the lack of priority that citizens with a learning disability experience in all of the work we do. That prejudice exists through Scottish society at every level. So there are always other reasons why action does not take place. It happens in social care, eligibility criteria are applied to decisions, and our support is cut. Many members now have no social care support in life at all. In our audio meeting a few weeks ago, our board set 5 priorities for our work over the coming 3 years. One of these is as follows. We will work with partners but celebrate our powerful experience world, because grouping us with others means everyone has to complete. The other pressures are just that we do not come high on the list. We have campaigned as experts for a law that is about us, just us, and we've led. We say loudly in all we do, Scotland should do nothing about us without us.
As Susan said, reasons for things not happening often stem from the prejudice Scotland has for us. We should have been removed from the definition of mental disorder. A system of supported decision-making should be established. Scotland has a chance to be a world leader and make significant change. Our responses to consultations, including Eldan, are informed by lives lost as well as still lived. The serious case review into the life and murder of Margaret Fleming gives even more evidence that things must be completely different. Inside the consultation document, now published on a strategy to mainstream human rights, we read these words: "We want to have laws that support Scotland to be a world leader in equality and human rights." What an excellent ambition. The chance is still there. But with respect, going ahead with the plans for Eldan will not do that. So we ask Scotland to pause and do what's required to secure our rights. Scotland can lead the world by creating a system of supported decision-making. It can remove learning disability from the definition of mental disorder. Scotland can act effectively on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Sir Robert Martin, the only person with a learning disability to ever sit as a United Nations committee member, invited Scotland to do that at every one of the sessions where he spoke to Scotland and the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, he died early this year, having asked again in March. Like many of our own members, his life was spent seeking the changes People First Scotland seek. His voice now powerfully and loudly shared by us.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. I want to start by acknowledging from our experience the commitment and support that was shown by the Minister and her team to this bill. I think that was very clear throughout, and they were very accessible and supportive from start to finish, and certainly Marie Todd showed a very personal commitment to the bill. However, with that, I think it can't be seen as anything other than profoundly disappointing for it not to proceed, and frankly, in terms of views, for it, to echo our colleagues, to be seen as simply it just wasn't important enough to be put on the agenda. This is a piece of legislation that, as was mentioned earlier by Susie, had commitment in several manifestos, that has broad cross-party support, that had a real opportunity for being taken forward, frankly, at a time when we don't often see a huge amount of cross-party collaboration in Parliament. So to see that dropped from the legislative programme, it's very difficult to see anything other than simply it just wasn't of importance to the government and to the Parliament to take that forward, which is profoundly disappointing, given the amount of effort that we've touched on already that has been put into this. I think as well, when you then tap that into seeing other bills that would have been alongside that, so as we see National Care Service, albeit more controversial, but certainly one that would have linked in for many of the people we serve, the Human Rights Bill as well, it just gives a sense overall that the priorities of the government are not sitting with the people that we serve, which I think has a huge impact in terms of their sense of importance and sense of ability to contribute and to be listened to and see that progress take place. I think the one thing I would throw in terms of other pressures, I know that it has been brought up in some of the feedback otherwise afterwards, that was potentially seen as potential complex interactions with human rights legislation. Now, if that is the case, then I think what we need to see very clearly is a pathway towards how that's being resolved, whether that's collaboration with UK government or elsewhere, because I think it runs risk otherwise of simply being an excuse that's put in rather than a justifiable explanation for how we try to overcome this. So I think, as I say, to reiterate, we certainly saw some real commitment to taking this forward, combined with some huge disappointment to see it put aside as not being a priority at this point.
Thank you, Jamie. Susie?
Thank you for the question. So I just want to reiterate that it was very clear to us that the Minister was very personally committed to this legislation, as was her team, who worked extremely hard on it. However, we, along with autistic people and their families, are deeply disappointed by the delay. Our understanding from the correspondence that we've received from the Minister in relation to the delay is that the reason for it is that there remains a diversity of views. We would disagree that there remains a diversity of views. We would say that there is very strong support for the legislation, and most of the proposed provisions that were put forward in the public consultation, and that is very evident in the analysis of the consultation responses, which was published in September, which, if I look to the three kind of areas that we saw as particularly transformative, there was strong support for statutory strategies, there was significant support for mandatory training in the public sector, and when we look at the accountability section, 65% of respondents who answered that question were supportive of a commission or commissioner model. So we don't agree that there's a diversity of views. We also saw the strong support for a commissioner model in the Closing the Accountability Gap report that we published, which showed that 96% of respondents were supportive, including 93% of autistic respondents. We recognise that there were still things that needed to be worked through in relation to the bill. You know, it was by no means completely tied up and ready to be introduced to Parliament. However, we believe those things could have been worked through with the three panels working with the Scottish Government, and it certainly shouldn't have been a reason to delay the legislation indefinitely. And also, it was going to go through a process of parliamentary scrutiny, which would have inevitably resulted in further changes to the bill as parliamentarians had their say on it. So it's safe to say we were very surprised that after 3 years of robust consultation, that was the reason given for, the main reason given for the delay.
Thank you, Susie. Jenny, would you like to come in?
I agree with Susie, but I guess there is an incredibly busy landscape there, again, pretty overwhelming in what was being proposed by all sorts of areas within government, but it just makes you feel like the voices of people with learning disabilities and neurodivergent people were at the bottom of the pile, I think, as People First very eloquently put, and what a powerful, emotionally charged, really had the hairs on the back of my neck from People First talking through their answer just then. But I also ponder on the finances, and I worry that a little bit like in the National Care Service, that there are voices of very dominant stakeholders, particularly those within the public sector, that maybe were the conflicting views, and that is a worry that those voices are allowed to be heard and take over from the lived experience and the absolute need for this bill. And that's probably all I want to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. Joe?
Certainly. Well, I think I'd put on record from Scottish Autism as well the acknowledgement of all the work that went in from the Minister and the team at the Scottish Government on this bill, particularly to get the consultation complete by the end of the summer. We were led to believe this was a priority. It was cited in the 2021 programme for government that work would begin on this. You know, it's really for the Scottish Government to answer how priorities may have changed or what has led to that, what pressures there may have been. I think it's worth repeating what Jamie said. You know, organisations, third sector organisations like all of ours, have given an awful lot to consultations in the course of this Parliament, whether that's about National Care Service, this bill, the Learning Disability Autism Neurodivergence Bill, the Human Rights Bill. You know, seeing all of those three things either paused or left, you know, to the point where it's unlikely that we'll see them in this Parliament now, really represents a kind of tranche of disappointment, but not just disappointment, a kind of a fatigue that comes with giving a lot to consultations, putting a lot into these, engaging our communities for them. So, it's frustrating that we won't see real changes in all these areas made that we hoped for. And I would echo, Susie's comments, really. We hear a lot about the need to establish consensus around some of the measures in the bill. There was really clear majority support for some of the measures in the bill around accountability, for example. Consensus is not the same as unanimity. I think there is a groundswell of support for this bill and measures for better accountability. At this point now, we just need some leadership to decide what's going to go into the bill and to take it forward.
Thank you, Joe. Dr. Simon.
Thank you. So I think we would generally agree with what's been said beforehand. And of course, we're very disappointed with the delay. And the Commission's priority now would be that we reach the best possible legislative solution with people with learning disabilities and with the whole learning disability community in Scotland, which is a difficult task and will take time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Maggie, please.
Thanks very much, Karen. Good morning to the panel and thank you for being here this morning. My first question is, what impact has the Scottish Government's decision had on your organisation and the people you represent and work with? And Susan, do you want to start?
There has been some impact. We might well have chosen to use some of the time over recent months a bit different. We are also so very busy, but nothing is wasted when we complete our work as experts in our life. We really hope that the change will embrace to bring about meaningful and just genuine changes. As we have said in all of our answers, the proposal and were never enough. There is more work to do, and we are looking forward to completing that work in partnership.
Okay, Jamie, can I come to you then?
Thank you. I think, as we've touched on, huge disappointment. We have our AGM coming up this Friday. We've also had recently the cross-party group on learning disabilities. And I think that disappointment, frustration, anger is certainly clear when you talk to people. I think the real risk is when you start to see any sense of resignation coming in, that sense, actually, what's the point of engaging if it's not going to go anywhere? What I would say, and I think it's been touched on particularly eloquently by Jenny, is the creativity and the innovation and the passion, and the fact that this isn't an optional extra, this is essential, this is what people have been living with for decades, means that hopefully the resignation is kept on the angry side and used to fuel new activity. But I think that is a real risk, and we can't underestimate that. Joe touched on that sense of fatigue. People have put a lot of effort and a lot of themselves into this, and there is a real risk. And I think we as organisations have a role to play in helping support the people we represent with that. But also I think that passes back to government and to Parliament and to wider society to also give us something to work with to show that progress is there. My hope is, and I think what we do see, is that actually that anger and that necessity of this will drive the next stages. So I know already we're talking about those collaborative opportunities. How do we continue this fight to take it forward, that it's not an option for us to simply give up on it? But I think it is about that sense of real frustration and anger, and I think that has to be heard, it has to be acknowledged, and realise that's coming not just from, frankly, the disappointment of this bill as it stands, but also from decades and decades of disappointment that people have had to experience.
Thanks, Jamie. Susie?
Hi, yeah, thank you for the question. So, disappointing is the word of the day. Obviously, we are deeply disappointed, and it's deeply disappointing for the hundreds, if not thousands, of autistic people and people with learning disabilities and their families who engaged in the consultation process. But the biggest impact, undoubtedly, is on those who are desperately waiting for change. As I've said, there are many autistic people who feel at best let down and at worst abandoned as a result of this delay. And the longer that this bill is delayed, the longer people wait for the support they need, the more people who are driven into crisis situations, the longer people go without education, without employment, in underemployment, the more people who end up in poor and declining health, and the more people who end up in institutional care instead of living in their own homes in the community. So it's not necessarily us as an organisation that is impacted, it's autistic people and their families. And I just want to quickly say that the status quo is promoting driving people into crisis, which has an immeasurable human cost, but is also unsustainably expensive to the public purse. So this will also have an impact on the public purse and on the public sector.
Thanks, Susie. That's a point well made, I think. Jenny, would you like to come in on this?
Value. Sorry, here we.
Sorry, Jenny, your microphone's not on. Can we have Jenny's microphone? Okay.
Great.
There we
Sorry about
That's
that.
okay.
It's me probably trying to do two things at once. So disappointment, as everybody else has said, and I think a real sense, a lack of value on lives, and a worry that lives will continue to be lost due to the inequitable access, particularly to health, screening, interventions, a lack of will to progress with practice that makes a difference. And just to highlight again, those mortality rates for people with a learning disability are just unacceptable. Dying from avoidable and preventable causes is unacceptable, but has for decades gone unaddressed. And not investing in this bill makes our community feel even more invisible, forgotten, and not cared about. But I think, building what Jamie said, this is also a driving. Families are so used to having to think about alternative solutions and innovations, and it's driving families and all of our organisations to consider what can we do now. But I know that's another question.
Thanks, Jenny. Joe.
Thanks. Well, there's, of course, the immediate effect, which everyone's spoken to, that's the sort of disappointment, the disillusion, the demoralisation, a loss of trust in the system again, and people facing the question of whether they do want to gird themselves for another round of consultation and input if it's not going to see effective change. But there is that more profound effect, the lack of systemic change that we desperately need. People are still excluded from education, from work, from community, from health services and so on. People are still fighting every day for the services to which they're entitled. And that goes on, and that is the real effect of this lack of momentum.
Thanks, Joe. And Simon, anything to add?
Thank you. We're also deeply disappointed that the bill will not be taken forward in this session of Parliament. The Commission's advisers with learning disabilities told us it feels like we're hidden again. I'm really, really angry. Actions speak louder than words, and we haven't got anything else left in the tank. So the development of a bill is still an opportunity to ensure that the human rights of people with learning disabilities are respected, protected and fulfilled, but this opportunity is now at risk. And in particular, significant effort will be needed to rebuild the trust and confidence of people with learning disabilities. So many people are upset and disappointed that the time and energy they put into responding to the consultation has not resulted in the bill being included in the programme for government. But we remain committed to working to progress the bill and to deliver transformational change with people with learning disabilities.
Thanks, Simon. If I can move on to my next question, then...
Can I just interrupt there, Maggie?
Yes,
Really
of
sorry.
course.
We have a supplementary from Tess
Sorry.
White on this question, but I'm going to suggest at this point that we suspend briefly for about 5 minutes, just to have a bit of a break, and then when we come back, Tess White can ask our supplementary question. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome back to the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. Just before we move on with the rest of the session, I wanted to suggest that we include Susan and Gregor in all of the questions that we're going to be asking, all the main questions, not necessarily the supplementaries, but if the other panel members would just like to come in if they have something different to add. And time's quite pressing on at the moment, and I just want to ensure that we get as much time on this as possible and get through as much of the questions as possible. So if we can keep answers succinct as well, I really appreciate that. So thank you all. So we'll now move on to Tess, please.
Thank you, Convener. So my question, I'll first ask Jenny, and then I'll ask Simon, and then if I ask Susan. So the question is, so for Jenny, MSPs are currently marking, sorry, yes.
Pardon me, sorry,
yes.
We're going to go to Susan first.
Oh,
please.
Susan.
Once
Great.
you've asked your question.
Oh, good. I'll go to Susan first. Thank you, Convener. So Susan, my question is, MSPs are currently marking 16 days of activism against gender-based violence campaign. So I understand that 90% of women with learning disabilities have been subjected to sexual abuse, with 68% experiencing sexual abuse before turning 18. So these are horrifying statistics. My question, Susan, is what changes do we need to see to protect women with learning disabilities from sexual abuse? And thank you.
Society does not see us as sexual beings or humans that are entitled to live lives like others, whether with partners or alone. Social workers act to remove our children rather than supporting us in our journey as parents. Lack of knowledge can also impact our lives even before we or our children are born. Parents who have a learning disability are not supported in private or family life. My network with partner organisation includes Equally Safe project development and wider issues of women's health, women's rights and gender-based violence. As Tess said, all the statistics horrify us. Scotland and the world move on from horror regarding our lives quickly. It has always has the whole world failing to prioritise us. We have spoken about a number of changes that would be meaningful. Over to Gregor.
As we say, the proposed LDAN bill had ideas within it that had potential for change. We're hopeful that some of the changes that People for Scotland has campaigned for over 35 years might finally move ahead. But as I say, they've remained unheard. And as I say, the actions are not words. This is required. Without legislation that is specific to us, Scotland will continue to fail us as humans with rights. Please look at our website and take time to watch the film that tells you why the legislation that's not specific to us in Scotland will continue to fail us. Scotland can lead the world by creating a system of supported decision-making. It can move learning disability from the definition of mental disorder. Scotland can act effectively on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Sir Robert Martin, the only person with a learning disability to ever sit as a United Nations Committee member, the only person with learning disability to ever sit at the United Nations Committee member, invited Scotland to do that every one of the sessions where he spoke to Scotland in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, he died earlier this year, having asked again in March. Supported decision-making his strongest message, so basically he made a very strong point that something has to be done about it.
Thank you. And going now to Simon and then Jenny, my addition is the Eldan Bill the right vehicle to tackle this? Simon.
Thank you. I think the Eldan Bill potentially has a role in tackling this. In terms of what changes are required generally to address these horrific statistics in this situation in society, I do think there's an element of this which does require cultural change, clearly, in relation to attitudes towards persons with disabilities. And I think these statistics reflect an interaction between that and cultural attitudes towards women and girls. So, at least to the extent that the Eldan Bill is a vehicle for cultural change, yes, there's potentially space there. And for systemic change, work that is currently ongoing includes work which People First have referred to, which we're working with People First on. So that there's work to embed equally safe and steering groups for that, along with a specific project, in our case, in developing a tool for self-audit within services. And personally, I can imagine a place within legislation to deal with such a specific and pernicious issue. And I do think that there are a lot of the issues that we're talking about in the context of potential development of an Eldan Bill are issues which are both affecting people with learning disabilities as a community as a whole, but even more so those issues which are really particularly specifically affecting this community. And in that sense, I could imagine a place for provisions in the bill for this issue.
Jenny, and thank you, Simon, but these are such horrific statistics, and a bill could take years, that we should be doing things, taking action now, rather than waiting years for a bill. So the question is this the right vehicle, and should we be doing things now?
Sorry, I may have misunderstood. I would entirely agree that now is the time for action. I was not thinking that any action should be delayed for a bill development process. I understood the question to be one as to whether it would be worth including, to which the answer could be yes.
So actually prioritising will help as a consequence, but action should be taken now. Jenny, over to you.
Yeah, yes, I absolutely think action needs to be taken now. And particularly in relation to training and workforce development. I think our families talk, I mean, this is a terrible saying, but they talk about the folk that their families are sitting ducks because people don't recognise the communication and the way that they are highlighting when things have happened to them. So I think we should be building on how we develop the workforce, how we develop learning and development. But unfortunately, if you make that just an option and you don't legislate, there are always organisations and staff that don't undertake that or don't then think about how that's put into practice. And I think it's about ensuring that people are reporting on what they're doing with their learning and development and that they are utilising it, particularly with people whose voices are difficult to understand and where actually people aren't making the reasonable adjustments to make sure that they are being listened to. But I think there's a huge underreporting probably of these cases and abuse in the community that we support, which is terrifying to even think about. But yeah, action needs to happen now, but then we need to make sure that it is legislated that enforces it into practice going forward.
You're nodding your head. Is there anything you'd like to say before I pass back to the convener?
I don't think I've got anything to add. Actually, I'm just, I would vociferously agree with my colleagues that we shouldn't delay any action because the legislation, it's been decided that the legislation is not going to be introduced before the election. And I know that we might come on to this if we have time. There's undoubtedly things the Scottish Government can do out with legislation. So I think all of us would urge the Scottish Government to take action on this issue along with others, especially with regard to serious human rights violations and abuses of this kind. But as Simon alluded to, the Eldan Bill has a place in shifting attitudes and shifting culture, and that is an important aspect of this.
I'll move to Maggie, please.
Thank you, Karen. So my next question is it possible that the proposals for the bill were too ambitious, or are they achievable? And I know that we've covered some of this before, but Susan or Gregor, do you want to pick this up first?
So, as we've said, they were not ambitious enough for us.
As Tess said, all the statues horrify us, Scotland and the world, moving on from the horror regarding our lives quickly.
Okay. Thank you both. Jamie, if I can come to you.
Absolutely not too ambitious, absolutely achievable. The rights exist, as we keep touching on, it's the accountability and the delivery of those, so absolutely achievable piece of legislation.
Thank you. Anybody else from the panel want to add anything else? Joe.
Thanks. Absolutely achievable, not over-ambitious, particularly if we look at those key overarching themes. But I just wanted to add, we're not at a standing start. We've had 10-year strategies in autism and learning disability worlds. We've piloted a lot of things during that time. We've tried different ways of supporting the development of professional skills, of trying different models of services. There was an awful lot of pilots and trials and reviews. So if, for example, we were to see as part of this legislation another strategy, we don't need to spend the first 3 or 4 years consulting. We've piloted things, we've tried things. What we need is a clear theory of change, a clear set of outcomes we want to achieve, and lay out the means to achieve them. That seems to me entirely doable.
Thanks, Joe. Anything else from any of the other panel members? No? Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We now have a supplementary from Tess White, please.
Just a quick supplementary to Jamie, if I may. So IJBs are on their knees. Councils are having to make swinging cuts to budgets. Self-directed support, as we know, is plagued with problems, and social care is in limbo because of the deeply flawed NCS bill, which is now being shelved. So given the wide-ranging nature of the bill and the importance of the bill, do you feel and do you believe that the infrastructure is in place to deliver on what the bill seeks to achieve? So there's an aspiration, but bearing in mind some of the other basics just haven't been put in place, particularly I've talked about IJB, social care. Is the infrastructure in place?
Thank you. So yes, there's no doubting social care, as we see on a daily basis, is in huge crisis, and that's going to require a huge amount of work across all parties in Parliament and beyond to start to address that. Far too long, social care as a sector and a profession has been undervalued, underinvested. We do not recognise the critical role that it plays across society, and until we address that, we're going to fundamentally continue to fail so many people in society, not just within the communities that we represent today, but also more widely. I think within LDAN itself, there are a number of the provisions within that that are not specifically tied to social care delivery itself. So I still think we are able to deliver with a lot of the infrastructure for some of the LDAN aspects that could take that forward. There's no doubting that increasing accountability would have pushback in social care as well, because we would be looking at that accountability around service providers, IJBs, local authorities, around people where people are being failed. Quite often that failure will be in the provision of the social care services that they're entitled to and that they don't receive. You touch on SDS. Far too often people are not given the information around the options that should exist to them and that they could take up on. So I think they're definitely interconnected. There's no doubting that, and as a social care organisation, we would obviously see this as a key priority. But I think that doesn't take away from the fact that LDAN within itself has a lot that could be achieved. As I say, the rights already exist. It's about that accountability and pushback that I think in turn would provide some benefits to social care without solving the crisis that we face at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Paul King, please.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Convener. And I would first refer to my register of interests, that I am a member of Enable Scotland and was previously employed by them. And having done that, I'll move straight into my question, which is, how and when was the decision to delay the bill communicated to your organisation? And we're going to start with Susan.
The decision was communication promptly and directly by the Minister and the Scottish Government team to our executive committee, which was welcome.
Well, just in the interest of time, because I appreciate we may have all realised at the same time, potentially. I'm seeing nods, so I don't know if, Jamie, do you want to...
I just wanted to add a couple of quick things, which I think, certainly, again, we had very prompt communication, which was very welcome. I would just add that through the cross-party group on learning disabilities, which obviously you chair, Paul, we were delighted that Jacqueline Campbell from Scottish Government team came to speak to the group, which was very welcome, and I know that there will be an outreach to Minister, so that was welcome. I think one thing I would give back as a slight piece of feedback from ourselves was it was noticeable that the initial feedback we were given was in a session with the Minister, which was very welcome. It was a session of learning disability groups, and then there was a separate session of groups working with autistic people. It did feel, if we're trying to create a collaborative bill, that perhaps that was a little bit siloed, but that's maybe just a personal reflection.
Anyone else want to add anything further to that? Susie?
Just to say that I think we probably all received very similar correspondence. So organisations on the stakeholder panel received a letter on the 4th of September, which is the same day that the programme for government was published, notifying us that the bill wasn't going to feature in the list of legislation for this year. There was a round of kind of sort of engagement with the Minister, and we subsequently received an email from the Learning Disability Autism and Neurodivergence team on the 11th of October to confirm that the bill would not be introduced before the 2021 Holyrood election. We did advise the Minister and her team that it felt like there was a little bit of a vacuum of communication in that stakeholder organisations had been told, but that wasn't really communicated to the public. So we were having to go out and tell people we support and people we represent.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Jamie.
Jenny would like
sorry,
to come in.
Jamie.
Thank you. So, and it was just, I suppose the only thing to add was that it was a very heartfelt letter and it was very personalised, which I think was quite unique. I don't know whether we've ever had that before, but it highlighted that our response had been read and acknowledged. And I guess with all the work that we all talked about putting in, actually at that time that meant something.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. What are your views on how the Scottish Government proposals to work with stakeholders and people with lived experience on developing draft bill provisions?
We'll go to Susan, please. Or Gregor. Thank you.
As we've said, we hope that there'll be different action more in line with realising our human rights. We always work in partnership, of course.
Thank you. Jamie, I know that you had mentioned earlier on that the amount of consultation you have been doing, and it's quite sad to see that the fact that, moving on, that these bills have not come forward, but all the work you do. So is there anything anybody wants to add to that, Jamie, or any of you? Yeah.
So I would say that we don't think there is a need to consult further, first of all. As I've already said, there were 3 years of consultation between the scoping exercise, the panels and the public consultation, which was a 4-month public consultation with over 800 responses. Many of those 800 responses included the views of tens, if not hundreds of individuals, because they were those of organisations like our own. And I think it's important for the Scottish Government to recognise that the starting point for any consultation on bill provisions is that people do feel let down. Some people feel abandoned. They've been asked for their views, not just through the public consultation, but for many years, and they're being asked again. And ultimately, we know what the issues are. We know what the systemic injustices are. We know what the challenges are. And actually, we do know what some of the solutions are to some of those issues. We're not saying the bill is a panacea or a silver bullet by any means, but we know that many of the proposed provisions in the public consultation would go a long way to addressing some of those systemic injustices. So we know all of that. So the Scottish Government needs to be very sensitive to that context. And I would say that any further consultation process on bill provisions has to demonstrate progress. So it has to be a very focused consultation. It has to be very focused on the wording of the bill and what is actually going to go into the bill, because we've had a very broad consultation process, which was very welcome, but we need to demonstrate that things are moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. So the committee has recently considered the Disability Commissioner Scotland Bill and heard views about the proposals for a Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Commissioner. The Scottish Parliament has agreed to a moratorium on new commissioners until a review is completed by June 2025. My question to the panel is, what are your views on the need for a Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Commissioner?
When a commissioner was proposed, People First clearly said that it was not top priority when other things need action. Those other things are the changes we have spoken about today. And so, once again, we must say that the law for us, about us, is a priority. And so, a commissioner is less of a focus for us.
Gregor, would you like to?
No.
No? Okay. Any other panel members? Yes, Joe?
Yeah, in regards to Commissioner, I think it's always worth sort of revisiting why a Commissioner was sought. We of course, read the report that came from the Finance Committee, which asserted that MSPs and committees like these were a means of accountability, and we recognise that, and full respect to committees like these. It's worth referring to my comments earlier, I think, that committees like government represent particular subject areas, particular foci. And the reason we've always sought a commissioner or a commission or some kind of dedicated body, whatever form that might take, is that we wanted someone to take a whole life view of the needs of autistic people and people with learning disabilities, and a whole system view, rather than replicating, policy silos or service silos that already exist out there. So that is what we have been seeking in terms of accountability, in terms of advocacy. And we feel that specific marginalised groups may well need their own dedicated body and to take that whole life view, that whole system view, to ensure that there's proper data available, to ensure that there's consultation directly with the communities involved, and to hold both government and services to account. So we have supported a commissioner or a commission, but it's always worth stating why that is, why we want that view, and why we want that accountability that takes that whole life, whole system view. And that is what I think we're seeking, which we need the bill to provide us with.
But can't that just happen without? I mean, it's so obvious things need to change. Culture needs to change. Why does it need a commissioner to actually get things done?
Well, it needs a catalyst because the status quo is failing so many people. So we need something different. We need some accountability in the system that is not there because people are fighting every day for the services they need. They're let down. Something needs to change. If the system was working, we wouldn't be asking for something different.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Marie McNair, please.
You Convener, what advice do you have for the Scottish Government as they develop the draft LDAN bill for consultation? Gregor.
We advise Scottish Government to act differently and see this from our expert perspective. There is still the chance to make real and secure change in our lives as humans now. A lower life expectancy is 20 years lower than for others. The information to manage health conditions, to book and attend appointments, to order medicines that can maintain better health is provided in ways that fail to include us. Members describe digital systems, appointment letters, leaflets about risks and side effects, websites for advice on self-management of long-term conditions that they cannot access. Social care is reduced and in crisis, so we do not have support to attend, to understand or to benefit. Annual health checks were promised but are not happening. We advise social government as expert witnesses to be brave and make change. Do not wait. Do not in another 5 or 10 years apologise and act to try and explain or redress more failure. Make change now.
Anyone else want to make comments? Susie, you've already expressed your view. Jamie?
Yeah, I think the... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Susan, sorry. To...
We asked the Scottish Government to abolish substitute decision-making and establish support decision-making across Scotland, realising and respect our human rights to independent and family life in our community. See us and celebrate with us as citizens with rights.
Thank you for that, Susan. Really appreciate that. Jamie?
Thank you. I think to echo the call, we need to see action. We can't just use these as constant ways of kicking things into long grass. I think we need to see honesty and realism. So the fact that this isn't in programme for government this year makes it highly unlikely that this will be deliverable before the 2026 elections. I understand and support and have a lot of empathy for why the team are still working on that basis. But I think what's really important is ensuring that whatever is captured at this stage is not lost. The worst possible outcome in many ways would be to head into a new parliamentary session and start this all over again. So ensuring that we have those processes to really build upon what has been happening for decades, but particularly over this process, this incredible wealth of information and creativity that we've captured so far.
Thank you. Anyone else? Simon?
And related to that point, people with learning disabilities who responded to the consultation have told us that there's an element of trust, which depends on how Scottish Government use their consultation responses to date. So I think Government will need to show people with learning disabilities how they've used what they've said to inform draft provisions, and then allow for detailed scrutiny of what comes out.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, so I think, just what we'd ask for really is please communicate what's happening and what it means for people who are now deeply invested in this process. Communicate regularly and clearly. Draft provision is a technical term. It's not one that everyone understands what that means and what it's going to look like. So that needs to be unpacked and made clear to everybody. I think we want to see a recognition of the level of consistent consensus that already exists, to my previous comments around what's needed, the urgency and the hunger for change that's felt around this, and the fact that we now sit with no strategy. The 10-year strategy is finished. We're not sure what's coming next. Legislation's been delayed, so our communities do need cause for hope rather than despair at this point.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. You're as disappointed as you. Jenny, do you have any other comments, or I don't want to leave you out there?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think there is a real opportunity for collaboration and agile working. I think, the fact that you're interviewing the third sector here, we have a very important role to play. And I think the government the civil servants have recognised that, but we need to build on that and we need to be equal partners. I think let's all get in the rooms together to talk about how we progress things and how we make changes and how we work in a more agile and collaborative way. But let's not us be the third party. Let's be an equal partner in that, because I think we have the voices of people that can make a difference. And we are forever inspired by family carers who come up with ideas and solutions. And within all of that evidence, there was a wealth of ideas about how things could be different. So let's harness that and take it forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our pre-prepared questions, and I recognise that some organisations may have not had time to think about the following questions that we're going to answer from now onwards. But if they want to respond in writing, that's perfectly fine. But if you do wish to come in, please just indicate by raising your hand. So we'll now move on to a question from Maggie, please.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thank you all for your answers so far. Some of you have hinted at some of this already, but the question is, given that the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill has been delayed, what outcomes do you think could be achieved without legislation? And Susie, can I come to you first?
Yes, thank you, Maggie. Thank you for the question. I think it's an important question. First of all, I would reiterate that there is an urgent need to legislate. I don't want to underplay that. And the three things that we think have the potential to be really transformative, which I've mentioned, statutory strategies, mandatory training in the public sector, and some kind of accountability mechanism, we think that they all require legislation to be effective. However, With that being said, I think there are a couple of areas the Scottish Government can work on without legislation. First of all, diagnosis, which didn't appear in the public consultation. Access to autism assessment and diagnosis is extremely difficult in Scotland, and I don't think the government needs to legislate in order to start trying to improve that situation. It should work on that at pace. We welcome some of the work it has done, but it needs to pick up the pace on that work. Education, I think there's a piece on education the Scottish Government needs to prioritise, which is understanding the scale of exclusion from education. We record absences and formal exclusions in this country. We do not record the use of part-time timetables, informal exclusions or internal exclusions. I've described it as an epidemic. It is an epidemic, and the Scottish Government doesn't understand the scale of it, and until it does, it can't hope to tackle that problem. Finally, as Jenny alluded to earlier, there's some work that can be done around training, especially to tackle some of the those most serious human rights violations and abuses. However, and I think the Scottish Government can take some of that forward. However, as Jenny alluded to, unless it is mandatory, it's always going to be piecemeal, and it's always going to be a postcode lottery of the kind of support that people get and the service that they can expect from the public sector. But those are areas I could see work happening now.
Thanks, Susie. That's really helpful. Jamie, did you want to come in on outcomes?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So I agree with everything that Susie said there. I suppose just expand a little bit on the data sense. Being relatively new to this sector, one of the things that struck me is how difficult it often is to find data, and particularly up-to-date data. Very often it's several years out of date. A lot of the stats we've talked about today are the most recent ones we can find access to. So I think something around how government could support a greater collation of data that will exist out there, but it's currently difficult to access, I think would be huge, both for decision makers but for organisations as well, in terms of how we best support the people we serve. I think there's also pieces that could be done around inclusive communications. I know that there was work being undertaken around kind of statutory requirement for inclusive communications, which has been dropped just now for various reasons. But I think there's pieces there that could definitely be rolled out. I know that a lot of organisations, SCL, do some fantastic work around this already. But actually, how could that be supported to at least break down some of the initial barriers to accessing support that could occur? But to agree and re-emphasise, as Susie said, legislation is required as well to provide that backbone and way of delivering on a lot of this, certainly in the longer term.
Thanks, Jamie. Yes, Joe.
Well, I'm going to echo the point about data. That's something we'd like to see. There's certainly not an equivalent for the autistic community of something like the Learning Disability Observatory, for example, at Glasgow. So we don't have an equivalent for the autistic community. I think to Susie's point about training and learning, I think we need to see investment in training that goes beyond awareness, beyond one and done autism awareness courses. We need proper attention to skills, inclusivity measures that can be learnt. And I think we need to be wary of the erosion of specialism we've seen in the education and indeed adult support sectors. We need people with proper specialist skills to support people with specific needs, I think, in all of our sectors, and that needs attention in professional education. The other thing I would say, we talked a little bit about social care. We need sustainable investment in those community-based services that often prevent people ending up in crisis, that kind of proactive support that people have. Post-diagnostic support for families, advice for individuals, peer support programs run by organisations like, autistic people's organisations, services the kind that organisations like Scottish Autism provide through our one-stop shop, our advice line, online groups. These are the services that have the least sustainable funding. They're the first to be cut, and these are the services that do prevent the human cost of crisis.
I think, we've been talking about things that have been in process for a long time, and the Christie principles around prevention can be included in that, can't they? Jenny, I know you want to come in on this as well. Go for it.
Yes, thank you. With colleagues. I wonder whether there is the possibility of reviewing our workforce. The group that we support are those with profound and complex needs, of which very often we put the least supported, the least supervised, the least qualified into managing the most complex people we have in our communities. And I wonder whether we can begin to think about that review of the workforce, the payment of the workforce, the support and supervision of the workforce. And certainly in the third sector, we're already already talking amongst ourselves about how we support each other to develop a workforce that is fit and able and supported and enabled to work with really complex people. So education and training is absolutely paramount, and we need to start that education and training at an undergraduate level and build on models that are already working. We have hundreds of students coming through our doors, and once they've been through the door, that changes their attitude and their culture. So I think those are things absolutely need legislation later on down the line, but we need to build on what we're already doing. But the other thing that frustrates me is that we have tons and tons of research, and we talked about the Scottish Learning Disability Observatory. They are providing, and what they're trying to do is look at how they implement that evidence into practice, and that's so essential. And I think that is something that we all need to commit to, is thinking about how do we put the evidence and best practice into practice and stop reinventing and re-researching when we know what absolutely works. And that data is incredibly important. And I would really hope that with our health checks, we will get more data, but we need the data to also highlight those with very complex needs that seem to just be in the midst, and we aren't expecting them to live. So we need to plan for their lives so that we build services around them. So I think there's tons, Maggie, that we can do, but we just need to be supported and coordinated in taking that forward.
Thanks, Jenny. That's really helpful. And Simon, yes, of course.
So we would think that progress on policy implementation across a range of areas is possible for people with learning disabilities, in addition to the need for development of legislation. And that depends on continued and increased investment across a range of areas. So, for example, the Coming Home programme to significantly reduce delayed discharges and appropriate out-of-area placements, helping to reduce the misuse of restrictive practices. And progress could also be made in a range of areas, rollout of annual health checks, good practice and supported parenting, improving support for employment, improving support for participation in the community, improving access to supported decision making, and of course more generally increasing access to accountability mechanisms, including judicial remedies. So across the board.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, Gregor, of course.
Because we are collective, we welcome a chance to come back in writing following time to consider.
Of course. Thank you, Gregor, for that. Okay. Back to you, Karen.
Thank you. We'll now have a question from Paul O'Kane, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. And possibly just following on from Maggie's contribution there, I mean, I'm interested in outcomes and really what outcomes we want to try and see. I think if we think about other aspects of policy as well and the particular challenges, so, you know, there are real concerns at the moment around the ending of non-residential care charges and that not having happened by the end of the Parliament, potentially. Learning disability health checks, we know that hasn't delivered. Not everyone is receiving those. We know that we've got a human rights bill that was sitting there that would have helped to address some of these things that actually is not going to progress either. So really just to get a sense from people about, you know, what outcomes are we going to achieve and what's your view on that, I suppose. Big question, I appreciate. So. Okay, Susie, thanks.
Thanks for the question, Paul. Yeah, I think there are obviously commitments that have been made, not just the Learning Disability Autism and Neurodivergence Bill, as you've alluded to. There are other things that we were all hoping would happen, some of which are still being worked on. I think that it's now more incumbent on the government to deliver on those other commitments, actually, in the absence of the bill coming forward before the election. So I would urge the Scottish Government to look at what it has said it's going to do for autistic people and people with learning disabilities that doesn't rely on the bill. Ending of non-residential care charges being one of them. We have the additional support for learning action plan, ensuring that that delivers and is impactful, which I am doubtful of at the moment. So I think it really needs to focus in on those things that aren't the bill and redouble its efforts to achieve those before the next election. I also just want to touch on the idea of barriers to achieving outcomes, and I think because of the implementation or accountability gap, however you want to term it, that I mentioned earlier, as I say, people are continually driven into crisis situations. And I think what's really important is that government needs to recognise that that is unsustainably expensive and acknowledge that there is a return on investment by implementing preventative spends. I don't think we're really seeing that at the moment. We're not seeing that recognition. And that preventative spend can look like lots of things. It can look like more support in schools, which young people are already entitled to but not receiving. It can look like more comprehensive social care packages in the community. It can look like improved access to diagnosis and follow-on support and being a model employer itself of autistic people. So I think that the accountability gap is a massive barrier, and we're not really seeing from government that it recognises that that is perpetuating crisis and that actually preventative spend is a positive way to spend money. So I just want to flag that.
Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, I think just goes back to that sense of this not feeling like wasted work and effort. I think this is a chance for government has recognised their own disappointment. I think we've all touched on that, and we really, I think Jenny was quite right. It's been very personal responses that we've received around the disappointment with this. This is a chance actually for governments to ensure that this work is taken forward, whatever outcomes in future may be in place. So I think ensuring that everything that's been collected so far is seen as part of an ongoing process. We've had a disappointment that it's not being delivered right now as it should be, but actually how do we ensure that there's something that continues, even if that's beyond the length of this Parliament? I think that could be quite a powerful stance for government to take to actually ensure that it was reaching out to others, quite rightly within third sector and elsewhere as equal partners, but also across party boundaries as well. And I think that would be something that would allow all of us to ensure that we're working effectively as we move into the next year and beyond as well.
Thank you. Jenny would like to come in as well. Oh,
I'm deferring to the convener here.
Jenny's been waiting, so I'll let Jenny.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I guess for us, I agree with everything everybody said, but for us, we want to see a decrease in mortality rates. And we have evidence, we have research, we have an idea about a profound learning and multidisability hub that would bring together experts so we don't lose all of that knowledge when people move from children to adult services. So I think there are solutions there, Paul, but actually what we really want to see is a decrease in people dying of avoidable and preventable deaths. And I think there are opportunities if we all work collectively to do that. So I will flag the Family Carers PMLD Hub that has a lot of answers within it, and happy to share that at another time.
Thanks, Jenny. Joe?
Thanks. I just wanted to sort of add a note. I suppose we rightly talk about preventative spend, and as I've said many times, we want to stop the crisis we see. But I think we also need to recognise that actually with the right support, people can flourish, they can contribute, they can thrive. And so we shouldn't always be thinking of the role of social care somehow to protect the NHS, or the role of community services, to prevent, a bad outcome down the line. These can provide good, positive, meaningful lives to people now if the right spend, the right sustainable spend is in place. So I think sometimes we also need to change the narrative. I prefer to talk about proactive services, but we absolutely need to invest in those if we want to see different outcomes.
Simon?
So with an outcome to be attained of reaching full inclusion, where all people with learning disabilities in Scottish society are on an equal basis with all citizens, there may be a key outcome of ensuring progress and continuing to shift society's perspective and expectations about the lives that people with learning disabilities can and do live, so that we fully value the lives of all people. And really, there's potential to develop work in many areas there. And related to that, on the government side, we probably need also to establish highly effective cross-directorate working as a norm. Scottish Government as a whole, I would say, has the opportunity to take strategic leadership in policy across directorates here by continuing to encourage and facilitate work across different policy areas and areas of spending, and also, of course, by co-producing solutions with people with learning disabilities and with the whole learning disability community.
Thank you. Gregor's intimated he'd like to come in as well. Thank you.
As we said, we have described the outcomes for our lives needed always. Outcome we need is to be heard on that.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. And now to a question from myself. What can the Scottish Government and public services do now to help support people with learning disabilities and neurodivergent people. And I'll come to Susie, please.
I'm actually going to probably reiterate the point I just made in response to Paul's question, which is that what we need to see is local government and national government prioritising that positive, preventative, proactive spend when it comes to supporting individuals. That's something that doesn't, first of all, require legislation, but actually I don't think legislation can actually necessarily affect that very directly. In many ways, I think it's something that the government should start doing now, and that's what we would like to see. You know, we want to see that shift so that individuals are not driven into crisis and can get the support they need when they need it. We know that statutory strategies, mandatory training and accountability are all key, but that shift can start to happen now. So I think that's what I would urge local government and national government to do.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on that question? Jenny?
I think we need to become an us rather than a them and us. And I have to say, at the moment, I feel very defensive and about how we work with public sector. And I feel that what we have to have is honesty and transparency and that collective wisdom to come together to look at solutions. I mean, at the moment, it is a battleground out there, and I understand how awful it must be to be in public sector, but the loss of empathy and the loss of being able to work together is dwindling, and it's putting everybody under pressure. So I think what we need to do is to think about how we create a level playing field and how we really listen and we learn and we listen with all of our senses to make sure that we're doing things together. But if we can't do things, we just have to be really honest. I mean, that letter, I'm obviously of an age where, you know, having a letter that says we really noted that you put a lot of effort into that and we really appreciate that. We don't appreciate each other very frequently. And I think it is so important. Our families, often, all they want to know is well, what is possible, and if it isn't possible, what might we be able to do together? And there seems to be a lack of honesty, particularly at a local level at the moment, that we need to combat.
Thank you. Anyone else? Joe?
I've mentioned before the idea of a whole life and a whole system approach, and we need to start thinking outside silos, you know, health over here, education over here, so that people don't, you know, fall through the cracks when they transition to adulthood, or if they're autistic and they don't have a learning disability or already have a long-term mental health problem, that there's a clear pathway for support them. We need to join the system up so that we take that whole life, whole system view and really make sure that people are included and their needs are met across the system.
Thank you. Jamie?
And just very quickly, I'd echo everything that's been said. I think that pathways of how people get support is critical, and we can be improving them now, regardless of the legislation. But I think as well, something, you know, one of the things we've touched on is such a success so far has been the lived experience panel. There's an opportunity for that to be something that's utilised more widely, rather than just being brought in when we're looking to talk about learning disabilities, autism and neurodivergence. How do we actually engage people across all these policies that are going to impact upon their lives, not just put them in a silo for specific pieces? So if that was something that could be explored more widely.
Okay, thank you. Simon, please.
And just to agree with what's been said, and perhaps to add to that, there could also potentially be work towards updated national guidance for health and social care partnerships and local authorities on developing local learning disabilities strategies, work that we've been involved in the past. And it may be useful to identify contributions which each of the existing scrutiny bodies can already make to upholding the rights of people with learning disabilities.
Thank you. So I just want to take this opportunity, as we came to the end of your questions, to ask the members if they're content, if they've asked everything that we'd like to ask. And would any of our witnesses today like to add anything that they feel they haven't been able to get across? No, everyone's content. That's a good sign. Thank you very much. So thank you. That concludes our formal business in public this morning. Thank you all again for attending today. We expect to take evidence from Marie Todd, the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport, on this bill at our meeting next week. And your evidence has been really helpful in informing that session. So thank you. We will now move into our private session to discuss the final items on our agenda. Thank you.